The Galactic Council chamber had never felt so empty before, and Ambassador Zexter stood in the center of the massive hall looking at the vacant seats where the human delegation used to sit. 3 cycles had passed since the humans walked out of the negotiations, and nobody had heard from them since that day. The silence from Earth was complete and absolute, like they had simply vanished from the galaxy itself. Ixtha remembered the last meeting with Eth. Perfect clarity, because the human ambassador had stood up calmly and collected her documents while the council members continued their heated debate about territorial rights and trade restrictions. She had not raised her voice or made any dramatic statements, but simply said that humanity was withdrawing from all negotiations indefinitely. The council had barely noticed her departure at the time, because they assumed the humans would come crawling back within days. Once they realized their mistake, Council Prime Krathenix sat in his elevated seat with his tentacles coiling and uncoiling in a nervous pattern that betrayed his growing concern. He had been the most vocal opponent of human demands during the negotiations and had publicly declared that humanity needed the Council far more than the Council needed them. Now, 3 cycles later, he was starting to question that assumption, but his pride prevented him from admitting it openly. The other council members gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves and casting worried glances at the empty human seats. The Varelnian representatives looked particularly uncomfortable because their trade routes depended heavily on human shipping contracts. The Corellian delegation kept checking their data pads, hoping for some message or signal from Earth that never came. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Earth defense ship, Valiant, watching the final human supply convoy leave the disputed border zones. His crew worked in efficient silence because they all understood the gravity of what was happening. Earth Command had issued clear orders that left no room for interpretation, and every human vessel and outpost in contested space was being evacuated. Immediately, Lieutenant Amy Brooks monitored her tactical display and reported that the Vrelnian fleet was already moving into the sectors that humans had just abandoned. Jake nodded slowly and told her to let them take whatever they wanted because it did not matter anymore. The disputed territories that had been the source of 6 months of fruitless negotiations were now the Council's problem entirely. Jake had participated in the peace talks as a military advisor and had watched the Council representatives treat his people with barely concealed contempt. They had demanded that humanity share their advanced technologies while offering almost nothing in return. They had insisted that human ships follow Council regulations in Council space, but refused to grant humans any voice in creating those regulations. Every compromise humanity offered was met with more demands, and every reasonable request was dismissed as human arrogance. The final straw had come. When the Council proposed that all human military vessels be required to carry Council observers at all times for security purposes, the human delegation had argued that this was an unacceptable violation of sovereignty, but the Council had been unmoved. They treated humanity like a problematic child that needed constant supervision rather than an independent civilization with its own rights and dignity. Back on Earth, in the capital city of Geneva, the President sat in his office reviewing reports from across human space. President Henry Walsh had made the decision to withdraw from negotiations after consulting with his advisors and military commanders. The choice had not been easy because isolation carried its own risks and costs, but continuing to participate in negotiations that treated humanity as a second-class civilization was simply not acceptable. Admiral Linda Hayes entered the office carrying a data pad filled with intelligence reports from the Council territories. She had been monitoring the situation closely since the withdrawal, and the signs already pointing to problems that the Council had not anticipated. Linda had spent 20 years in military service and had developed a keen understanding of strategic dynamics and power relationships. Henry looked up from his desk and asked what the Council was saying about the human withdrawal. Linda smiled slightly and reported that the Council was sending daily inquiries, demanding to know humanity's intentions and requesting immediate resumption of negotiations. Each message was more urgent than the last, and the tone had shifted from commanding to pleading. The council had made a fundamental miscalculation because they assumed that humanity needed them more than they needed humanity. They had looked at human civilization as newcomers to the galactic stage, who should be grateful for any attention or recognition from the established powers. What they failed to understand was that humanity had been carefully building economic and military capabilities that made them indispensable to the current galactic order. Henry asked Linda about the strategic repositioning of human forces, and she confirmed that all personnel and assets had been successfully withdrawn to human-controlled space. The borders were now sealed, and no human vessel would enter Council territory without explicit authorization from Earth Command. The galaxy would have to learn to function without human participation. The decision to withdraw completely rather than simply walking away from negotiations had been deliberate and calculated. Henry and his advisors understood that half measures would not be effective in making their point. The Council needed to feel the full impact of human absence before they would truly understand what they had taken for granted. Linda mentioned that several independent species had reached out to Earth privately expressing support for the human position. These smaller civilizations had their own grievances with the Council's heavy-handed approach to galactic governance, but lacked the power to challenge it directly. They saw humanity's withdrawal as a brave stand against an institution that had grown arrogant and disconnected from the needs of regular civilizations. Jake Morrison received new orders from Earth Command instructing all defense vessels to maintain defensive positions at the borders of human space. There would be no patrols beyond human territory and no assistance to Council vessels, even in emergency situations. The orders specifically stated that humanity was not at war with the Council, but was simply choosing to disengage from all interactions until such time as the Council demonstrated genuine respect for human sovereignty. Amy Brooks asked her captain if he thought the Council would eventually come around, and Jake considered the question carefully before responding. He said that pride was a powerful force, and the Council had built their entire identity around being the supreme authority in the galaxy. Admitting that they needed humanity would require them to fundamentally reconsider their place in the galactic order, and that kind of change rarely happened quickly or easily. The silence from Earth continued for days and then weeks, while the Council waited for humanity to blink first. But the humans had no intention of blinking because they had finally realized something important about their relationship with the galaxy. Respect could not be negotiated or bargained for because it had to be earned through demonstration of value and willingness to walk away from relationships that did not serve mutual interests. Ambassador Zexter stood alone in the Council chamber long after the other delegates had left for the day. He stared at the empty human seats and wondered if his civilization had made a terrible mistake. The thought was disturbing because it challenged everything he believed about the Council's rightful place as leaders of the galactic community. But the empty seats seemed to mock that certainty and whisper uncomfortable truths about power and respect that he was not yet ready to acknowledge. The first signs of trouble appeared exactly 14 days after the human withdrawal, when the Varelnian trade networks began experiencing severe delays in their shipping schedules. Trade Minister Volchak sat in his office, surrounded by reports from across Varelnian space, and each one told the same story of mounting chaos and disruption. Cargo vessels that should have arrived weeks ago were still in transit, and some had not even departed their origin points because the logistics networks had simply stopped functioning properly. Volchak had spent the previous night reviewing the data, trying to understand how things had fallen apart so quickly. And the answer was painfully obvious once he stopped making excuses. Human merchant vessels had been carrying approximately 30% of all galactic commerce for the past 5 years, and their efficiency has been so reliable that everyone had simply taken it for granted. The human ships moved faster and carried more cargo and operated with a level of precision that other species had never managed to replicate. The Varelnian shipping companies had their own fleets, of course, but those vessels were older and slower and required larger crews to operate. When Volchok calculated the actual cost of replacing human shipping capacity with Vrelnian vessels, the numbers made him feel physically ill. It would take 3 Vrelnian ships to do the work of 2 human ships, and the operational costs would be nearly double what they had been. Paying for human services, food. Shipments were the most immediate crisis, because agricultural products from the Outer Rim colonies had always moved on human cargo. Vessels that could maintain perfect environmental controls during transit. Now those shipments were being delayed by weeks, and entire harvests were spoiling before they reached their destinations. The Vrelnian population on the core worlds was starting to notice shortages in their markets, and the government was facing increasing pressure to resolve the situation. Medical supplies represented another critical problem because many specialized pharmaceuticals required rapid transport under specific conditions that only human vessels had been able to guarantee. Hospitals across Vrelnian space were reporting shortages of essential medications, and some facilities were being forced to ration treatments. Volchak had received 3 emergency petitions from medical administrators begging him to restore human shipping contracts. By any means necessary, the Krelian manufacturing sector was experiencing its own catastrophic breakdown because their entire industrial system had been redesigned around human efficiency protocols. Commander Steve Parker read the intelligence reports from his station on Mars. Command with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The Krelians had invited human engineers 5 years ago to help modernize their factories, and the results had been spectacular, with production increasing by 40% within the first year. That the human engineers had not just made minor adjustments but had completely reimagined how Krelian manufacturing operated by introducing new quality control systems and supply chain management techniques. The Krelians had been thrilled with the improvements and had quickly expanded human involvement across their entire industrial base. Now those same factories were grinding to a halt because the Krelian workers had never fully understood the systems they were operating. Lieutenant Karen White analyzed the data from Krelian industrial zones and reported that their production output had dropped by nearly 60% in just 2 weeks. The Krelians were frantically trying to reverse engineer the human protocols, but they lacked the institutional knowledge and experience to make sense of what they were seeing. Karen pointed out that humanity had spent 2 centuries developing these systems through trial and error and countless innovations, and the Krelians expected to replicate that in a matter of weeks. Steve shook his head and commented that the Council had never bothered to understand where human capabilities actually came from because they assumed that any species could achieve the same results with enough effort. What they failed to grasp was that human industrial culture had evolved through specific historical circumstances and competitive pressures that had forced constant innovation and improvement. You could not just copy the final result without understanding the entire developmental process that had created it. The economic disruption spread rapidly through Council space as the interconnected nature of the galactic economy became painfully apparent. The Thelian colonies discovered that their mining operations could not function properly without human geological survey data that had been provided as part of standard trade agreements. The Vrelnian agricultural worlds realized that their crop yields had been enhanced by human-developed fertilizer compounds that they could no longer acquire. Ambassador Zexther attended an emergency Economic Council meeting where representatives from 24 species gathered to discuss the mounting crisis. The atmosphere in the meeting room was tense, and accusations flew back and forth as different delegations tried to assign blame for the situation. Some representatives argued that the Council should simply seize human assets and technologies by force, while others pointed out that such action would likely trigger a war that nobody was prepared to fight. The financial markets were beginning to panic as investors realized the full scope of the problem, and stock values for major galactic corporations were dropping precipitously. The Vrelnian central bank had been forced to intervene 3 times in the past week to prevent a complete market collapse. Currency exchange rates were fluctuating wildly as traders tried to assess which economies would be most affected by the loss of human economic participation. Volchak presented a detailed analysis to the Economic Council showing that the situation would only worsen over time unless human cooperation was restored. He explained that the immediate disruptions they were experiencing now were just the beginning because many systems would take months or even years to fully fail. The Council had built its economic prosperity on a foundation that included significant human contributions, and removing that foundation meant the entire structure was at risk. The smaller, independent civilizations that had always struggled under Council economic policies were watching the crisis with interest. Some of them had maintained quiet trade relationships with humanity, and those connections were now proving invaluable. Earth had made it clear that existing contracts with non-Council species would be honored and even expanded if desired. Several independent worlds were discovering that they could negotiate much better terms with humanity now that the humans were not constrained by Council regulations. Council Prime Krathenix received a private briefing from his economic advisors, and the news was worse than he had imagined. The advisors estimated that the Council economy would contract by at least 15% over the next year if human participation was not restored. Some sectors might experience declines of 30% or more. The social and political consequences of such an economic disaster would be severe and could potentially destabilize governments across Council space. Krathenix asked his advisors why nobody had predicted this outcome before the humans withdrew. The senior advisor explained that most Council analysts had assumed human economic contributions were easily replaceable because they had never seriously studied how deeply integrated humanity had become into galactic commerce. It was a failure of imagination and arrogance, combined because the Council had been so convinced of its own superiority that it never considered the possibility of dependence on a younger species. The reports kept coming in day after day, and each one painted a bleaker picture than the last. Factory closures were being announced across Krellian space, and unemployment was rising rapidly. Vrelnian citizens were protesting in the streets, demanding that their government fix the food shortages. The Thelian Mining Consortium had laid off 30,000 workers because their operations were no longer profitable without human technical support. Steve Parker compiled all the intelligence data into a comprehensive report for Earth Command, and his conclusion was simple and direct. The Galactic Council was facing an economic crisis entirely of its own making, and the situation would continue to deteriorate until they acknowledged the reality of their dependence on human capabilities. The question now was how long their pride would allow them to suffer before they were willing to make the necessary concessions to bring humanity back to the negotiating table. President Henry Walsh read the report in his office and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The withdrawal had been a calculated risk, but it was proving effective beyond his initial expectations. The Council was learning a painful lesson about the difference between tolerance and respect. Humanity had never asked to be worshipped or feared, but they had every right to demand treatment as equals and partners rather than as convenient servants whose contributions could be taken for granted. The Zektar Marauders had been operating in the outer regions of Council space for nearly 30 years as a constant nuisance that raided isolated outposts and cargo convoys. The Galactic Council had always treated them as an acceptable level of criminal activity because the Marauders were smart enough to avoid major military targets and limit their attacks to targets that would not provoke a massive response. Council security forces would occasionally chase down a Marauder squadron, but these efforts were half-hearted at best because nobody considered the raiders to be a serious threat to galactic stability. What the Council never knew was that human patrol fleets had been systematically containing the Marauder threat for the past 5 years. Captain Jake Morrison had spent 18 months conducting anti-piracy operations in the border regions, and he knew exactly how extensive the human effort had been. Human intelligence networks had penetrated deep into Marauder. Command structures and human warships had intercepted dozens of planned raids before they could be executed. The humans had even used diplomatic channels to cut off Marauder supply lines by pressuring certain independent worlds to stop providing them with fuel and ammunition. The Marauders had grown frustrated by their declining success rate, but they had never understood why their operations kept failing. They blamed bad luck and poor planning, without realizing that human forces were actively disrupting their activities across multiple sectors. The Marauder leadership had been forced to scale back their ambitions and stick to much smaller targets just to survive. Now, with the humans suddenly gone from Council space, the Marauders were about to realize that the galaxy had become vulnerable in ways that nobody had anticipated. First major attack came without warning against 3 Thelian colony worlds on the outer rim that had minimal defensive capabilities. Marauder battle groups numbering over 40 ships appeared simultaneously in all 3 systems and overwhelmed the local defense forces within hours. The Thelian commanders sent desperate distress calls to Council headquarters begging for immediate military assistance, but the nearest Council fleet was 6 days away at maximum speed. By the time help arrived, the Marauders had stripped the colonies of everything valuable, including industrial equipment and medical supplies and food stores. They had also taken several thousand Thelian civilians as captives to be sold as laborers on the black market. The Marauder fleet vanished into uncharted space before the Council ships could engage them, and the rescue force found only devastation and desperate survivors who had been left behind. Ambassador Zexter reviewed the security footage from the Thelian raids and felt a cold dread settling into his chest cavity. The Marauders had attacked with a level of coordination and boldness that had never been seen before. Their timing had been perfect, and their intelligence about the colony's defenses had been accurate. Someone within the Marauder organization had clearly been planning this operation for months and had waited for exactly the right moment to strike. The Council convened an emergency security meeting to discuss the raids and analyze what had gone wrong. The Thelian ambassador was furious and demanded to know why the early warning systems had failed to detect such a large Marauder fleet entering Council space. The head of Council security shifted uncomfortably and admitted that the early warning network had relied heavily on human monitoring stations that were no longer operational. The human stations had been positioned strategically throughout the border regions and had used advanced sensor technology to track ship movements across vast distances. When the humans withdrew, they had taken their equipment with them, and the Council had assumed they could simply replace that coverage with their own systems. What they discovered was that replicating human sensor capability would require building dozens of new stations at enormous cost. And even then, the coverage would not be as comprehensive. The Marauder raids escalated rapidly over the following weeks as the raiders realized the full extent of the opportunity before them. Shipping lanes that had been safe for years suddenly became hunting grounds where merchant vessels were easy prey. Colony worlds that had never needed heavy defenses found themselves vulnerable to attack. The Galactic Council was forced to redeploy military forces across dozens of sectors trying to cover all the gaps that human withdrawal had created. Council Prime Krathenix received hourly updates on the security situation, and each report was worse than the last. The Marauders had struck 5 more targets in the past week alone, and Council forces had failed to intercept any of the raids. The military commanders were struggling to adapt to a threat they had never properly prepared for, because they had assumed that Marauders would remain a minor nuisance forever. Nobody had planned for what would happen if the raiders became organized and aggressive. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant monitoring the intelligence reports that came in from observers stationed near Council space. His orders from Earth Command were absolutely clear, and there would be no intervention, regardless of how bad the situation became. The humans had offered their military cooperation to the Council as part of the negotiations, and that offer had been rejected with contempt. Now, the Ascental would have to face the consequences of that rejection. Lieutenant Amy Brooks watched the tactical displays showing Marauder movements throughout the region and asked her captain how long they would simply observe while civilians were being killed and captured. Jake understood her frustration because every member of his crew had been trained to protect the innocent and respond to distress calls. Standing by while people suffered went against everything they believed in as military professionals and as human beings. Jake reminded his crew that their duty was to follow orders and trust that Earth Command understood the larger strategic picture. If they intervened now, they would be undermining the entire purpose of the withdrawal and sending the message that humanity would always come running when the Council needed help. The Council had to learn that human assistance was valuable and that treating humanity with disrespect carried real costs. The Vrelnian Defense Force attempted to set up convoy protection for merchant vessels traveling through dangerous sectors, but they lacked the ships and resources to cover all the necessary routes. Vrelnian captains who had spent years relying on human patrol coverage suddenly found themselves navigating through hostile space without backup. Several Vrelnian merchants petitioned their government to negotiate directly with Earth for protection services, but Council law forbade member species from making independent military agreements with outside powers. The Thelian government sent a private communication to Earth Command requesting human military assistance and offering to pay whatever price was necessary. The message bypassed the Council entirely and represented a direct challenge to Council authority over its member species. Jake received notification of the Thelian request and immediately forwarded it up the chain of command for decision. President Henry Walsh read the Thelian request with interest because it represented exactly the kind of crack in Council unity that he had anticipated. The smaller Council species were realizing that their loyalty to the Council was not being reciprocated with adequate protection. Henry instructed his advisors to send a polite refusal to the Thalians, explaining that Earth could not provide military assistance to Council members without formal authorization from the Council itself. The message was diplomatic, but the underlying point was clear, and humanity would not undermine the Council's authority even as that authority was proving inadequate. The Marauders continued their campaign of raids and attacks, growing bolder with each successful operation. They hit a major Krellian industrial complex and made off with advanced manufacturing equipment worth millions of credits. They ambushed a Vriaunian diplomatic convoy and held the ambassadors for ransom. They even attacked a Council military depot and destroyed several ships that were undergoing repairs. The galactic media began running stories about the security crisis and questioning the Council's ability to maintain order in its own territory. Public opinion across Council space was turning increasingly critical as citizens demanded to know why their government seemed powerless to stop the Marauder threat. Some commentators began pointing out that the raids had only escalated after humanity withdrew and asking uncomfortable questions about what role the humans had been playing in maintaining security. Steve Parker compiled another intelligence report for Earth Command, noting that the Council was facing a security crisis that threatened to destabilize multiple governments and undermine confidence in the entire Council system. The Marauders had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Council military capabilities that had been masked for years by human activities that nobody had properly acknowledged or appreciated. The question now was whether the Council would swallow its pride and admit that it needed human help, or whether it would continue to struggle ineffectively while more civilians suffered and died. Council Prime Chthonics stood before the assembled delegates of the Galactic Council, and for the first time in his long career, he felt genuine fear about the future. 3 months had passed since the human withdrawal, and the situation had deteriorated far beyond anyone's worst predictions. The economic damage was now measured in trillions of credits, and the security crisis showed no signs of improvement. 16 colony worlds had been attacked by Marauders in the past month alone, and Council military forces seemed powerless to stop the raids. The emergency session had been called to address what everyone now privately acknowledged was a catastrophic failure of Council policy. The chamber was packed with delegates from every member species, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. Chthonics had spent the previous night reviewing proposals and counterproposals, trying to find a path forward that would not require complete humiliation, but he had come to accept that pride was a luxury. They could no longer afford Trachonics. Began his address by acknowledging that the Council had made serious errors in judgment regarding humanity and their role in galactic affairs. The words came hard because admitting mistakes went against every instinct he possessed as a leader, but the alternative was watching the council collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. He explained that human contributions to galactic commerce and security had been far more substantial than anyone had properly understood or appreciated. Ambassador Zexter listened to the speech and felt a mixture of relief and shame washing over him. Relief because the council was finally facing reality, and shame because he had been one of the loudest voices arguing for harsh treatment of human demands during the original negotiations. He had called humanity arrogant and overreaching when they asked for equal representation. He had insisted that their technological advantages were temporary and would soon be matched by other species. He had been wrong about everything. The debate that followed Krathanik's opening statement was fierce and emotional as different factions within the council argued about how to proceed. The hardline delegates insisted that approaching humanity now would make the council look weak and desperate. They argued that given enough time, the council could solve its problems without human help and restore its independence and dignity. The pragmatic delegates' coup and teared that time was exactly what they did not have, because every day of continued crisis was eroding public confidence and threatening social stability. The Thelian ambassador rose to speak, and his voice carried the pain of someone whose people had suffered directly from the security failures. He described the thousands of Thelian civilians who remained in marauder captivity and the devastated colonies that were struggling to rebuild. He asked the hardline delegates how many more attacks they were willing to accept before they admitted that council forces could not handle the marauder threat alone. His words silenced many of the objections because nobody could offer a convincing answer. The vote was called after 6 hours of heated discussion, and the measure passed by the narrowest possible margin. The council would extend a formal invitation to humanity to resume negotiations with full recognition as a council-level power. The invitation would include offers of equal voting rights and full participation in all council decisions. It stopped just short of a formal apology, but the concessions being offered represented a dramatic reversal of the council's previous position. The task of drafting the actual message fell to a committee of senior diplomats who spent 3 days carefully choosing every word. The communication needed to convey respect and genuine desire for partnership without appearing weak or desperate. It needed to acknowledge that the council had underestimated humanity while maintaining that the relationship would be mutually beneficial going forward. The final draft was reviewed by Krathanik's personally before being transmitted to Earth. President Henry Walsh received the council's message in the Oval Office with Admiral Linda Hayes standing beside him. He read through the carefully worded invitation twice before setting down the datapad and looking at his military advisor. Linda had already reviewed the message, and her expression told him that she understood the significance of what they were seeing. The council was offering humanity everything they had asked for. During the original negotiations and more, Henry asked Linda for her assessment of the offer, and she explained that it represented a complete capitulation. On every major point of disagreement, the council was granting humans full voting rights and equal representation and acknowledging human sovereignty over their territory. They were offering access to council technologies and research facilities. They were even suggesting the creation of a joint military command structure for coordinating anti-piracy operations. It was everything humanity could have reasonably hoped to achieve through negotiation. Linda then asked the critical question about whether Earth should accept the offer immediately. Henry was silent for several minutes, considering the implications of his response. The isolation had been costly for humanity as well, with restricted trade access and limited technology exchanges and constant vigilance against potential council aggression. Accepting the offer would restore human access to galactic commerce and open up new opportunities for cooperation and advancement. But Henry understood that how they responded to this offer would set the tone for the entire future relationship between humanity and the council. If they accepted too quickly or too eagerly, the council might conclude that the withdrawal had been a bluff and that humanity was desperate to return. That perception would undermine everything they had worked to achieve over the past 3 months. The council needed to understand that respect was earned through consistent action over time, and not just through words in a diplomatic message. Henry made his decision and instructed Linda to draft a response that would decline the immediate offer while leaving the door open for future negotiations. The response would acknowledge the Council's invitation and express appreciation for the recognition being offered. But it would also make clear that humanity required more than words before committing to a renewed partnership. The Council would need to demonstrate, through concrete actions, that they genuinely respected human sovereignty and valued human contributions. Linda understood the strategy immediately and began out the specific conditions that Earth would require before agreeing to resume negotiations. Fair trade agreements that treated human merchants as equals rather than subordinates. Recognition of human territorial claims that the Council had previously disputed. Full access to Council technologies and research without restrictions or oversight. Most importantly, a formal acknowledgement that the security situation had only deteriorated after human withdrawal, and that human military capabilities were essential to maintaining galactic stability. The response was transmitted to the Council 3 days later, and its contents sent shockwaves through the Council chamber. Many delegates had assumed that humanity would jump at the opportunity to return. The rejection caught them completely off guard. Some interpreted it as an insult, while others recognized it as a negotiating position designed to extract maximum concessions. Krathenix read the human response with a growing sense of respect because he understood exactly what President Walsh was doing. Ambassador Zexter was assigned to lead a special task force charged with analyzing Earth's demands and developing a response strategy. The task force worked around the clock, reviewing each condition and assessing what concessions the Council could reasonably make. The discussions were difficult because every concession represented a diminishment of traditional Council authority. But the alternative was continued economic decline and security crisis. The Vrelnian delegation argued strongly for accepting human terms because their economy was in free fall and their citizens were demanding action. The Krellian representatives agreed because their manufacturing sector had still not recovered from the loss of human technical expertise. Even the traditionally proud Thelian government indicated that they would support whatever measures were necessary to restore human security. Cooperation. Zexter compiled the task force findings into a comprehensive report that concluded the Council had no realistic alternative but to accept the bulk of human demands. The report acknowledged that this would represent a fundamental restructuring of galactic governance, but argued that such restructuring was long overdue. The Council had grown complacent and arrogant during its centuries of dominance, and humanity's withdrawal had exposed fatal flaws. In the entire system, Council, Prime Krathenix read the report alone in his private chambers and made peace with what had to happen next. The Council would agree to human terms and invite them back to negotiations on their own conditions. It would be humbling and difficult, but it would also be the beginning of something potentially better than what had existed before. The humans had proven that they were strong enough to stand alone, and that strength made them worthy partners rather than subordinate clients. The galaxy was about to learn a new way of conducting its affairs, and the Council would either adapt or become irrelevant. The negotiations resumed 2 weeks later, but not in the Grand Council chamber, where the previous talks had collapsed in mutual frustration and resentment. President Henry Walsh had insisted on neutral ground, and the location chosen was a human-built space station positioned exactly at the border between human territory and Council space. The symbolism was deliberate and impossible to miss, because humanity was not coming to the Council as supplicants, but meeting them as equals on ground that neither side controlled completely. Ambassador Zexter led the Council delegation, and he felt a strange mixture of nervousness and hope as his shuttle approached the human station. The structure was impressive in its efficiency and design, with clean lines and practical architecture that reflected human engineering philosophy. As he disembarked and was greeted by human security personnel, he noticed that they treated him with professional courtesy, but Without the deference that council officials usually expected from others, the human delegation was led by Ambassador Michelle Carter, who had walked out of the original negotiations 3 months earlier. She welcomed the council representatives to the station and guided them to a conference room that had been set up specifically for these talks. Captain Jake Morrison was present as the military liaison, along with several human economic and technical advisors. The atmosphere was businesslike and focused, without any of the theatrical posturing that had characterized the previous meetings. Michelle opened the session by thanking the council for agreeing to meet on neutral territory and acknowledging that both sides had much to discuss. She made it clear from the outset that humanity was interested in building a genuine partnership, but only if that partnership was based on mutual respect and fair treatment. The days of one-sided agreements where humans provided value and received little in return were over and would not be returning, regardless of how the negotiations proceeded. Zexter responded carefully because he understood that every word he spoke would be analyzed and weighed by the humans. Sitting across the table, he acknowledged that the council had made errors in judgment during the previous negotiations and had failed to properly appreciate human contributions to galactic stability and prosperity. He stated that the council was now prepared to offer humanity full partnership status with all the rights and responsibilities that such status entailed. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything Zexter had experienced in his long diplomatic career. Humans came to every session with detailed proposals backed by comprehensive data and analysis. When the council made an offer, the humans would examine it thoroughly, point out exactly where it fell short of genuine equality. When disagreements arose, the humans argued their position with logic and evidence rather than appeals to tradition or authority. Jake Morrison watched Ambassador Zexter's reactions throughout the first week of talks, and he could see the Vrelnian diplomat gradually adjusting to the new dynamic. Zexter had spent decades in an environment where the council's word was effectively law, where smaller civilizations had no choice but to accept whatever terms were offered. Now he was discovering what it meant to negotiate with a partner who had options and leverage and was willing to walk away if the terms were not acceptable. The economic discussions proved particularly challenging because the council wanted to restore human participation in galactic commerce immediately, while the humans insisted on establishing fair trade frameworks first. Michelle explained patiently that humanity would not return to a system where human merchants were subject to council regulations. They had no voice in creating. The humans demanded representation on all trade policy committees and the right to negotiate bilateral agreements with individual council species. The council delegates struggled with these demands because they represented a significant erosion of centralized council authority. Several members of Zexter's team argued privately that giving humans such broad economic powers would set a dangerous precedent for other species. Zexter countered that the precedent had already been set when humanity demonstrated they could survive and thrive without council participation. The choice was not between maintaining control and granting concessions, but between adapting to new realities and watching the council become increasingly irrelevant. The security discussions moved more smoothly because the Marauder crisis had made the value of human military cooperation painfully obvious to everyone involved. Jake presented detailed plans for joint patrol operations and intelligence sharing that would restore the security envelope that had existed before the human withdrawal. The council delegates accepted these proposals with minimal debate because they desperately needed human help to bring the Marauder threat back under control. But Jake also insisted on clear rules of engagement and command authority that would prevent the kind of exploitation that had characterized some earlier joint operations. Human ships would not be subordinate to council commanders and would maintain independent operational authority. Human intelligence would be shared with council forces, but the humans would control their own networks and sources. The military partnership would be exactly that, and a partnership between equals rather than a hierarchy with humans. Serving as auxiliary forces, the talks continued for another 3 weeks as negotiators worked through hundreds of specific issues and concerns. There were moments of frustration and disagreement, but the overall tone remained professional and focused on finding workable solutions. Michelle and Zexter developed a working relationship built on mutual respect even when they disagreed on particular points. Both recognized that they were not just negotiating a treaty, but establishing a new framework for how humanity and the Council would interact for generations to come. The final agreement was a comprehensive document that covered trade and security and technology, sharing and diplomatic representation. Human territory was formally recognized as sovereign with all the rights that sovereignty implied under galactic law. Human vessels received full navigation rights throughout Council space without discriminatory restrictions. Human technologies would be shared with Council members in exchange for access to Council research and development facilities. Most significantly, humanity was granted 3 permanent seats on the Galactic Council with full voting authority on all matters. President Henry Walsh reviewed the final treaty text in the Oval Office. With his advisors gathered around him, Admiral Linda Hayes pointed out that they had achieved everything they had initially demanded, and more. The agreement not only restored human participation in galactic affairs, but did so on terms that treated humanity as a genuine great power rather than a useful junior. Partner Henry signed the treaty on behalf of Earth and transmitted his authorization to Ambassador Carter at the negotiating station. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the following day and would be broadcast across both human space and Council territories. Henry knew that some humans would criticize the agreement as too generous to the Council, while some Council members would see it as an unacceptable surrender of authority. But he believed that the majority on both sides would recognize it as a fair and necessary adjustment to changed circumstances. The signing ceremony took place in the main conference hall of the Neutral Station with representatives from dozens of species in attendance. Michelle Carter and Ambassador Zexter sat at the central table and affixed their signatures to the treaty documents while cameras captured the historic moment. The symbolism of the neutral location had not been lost on anyone, and the ceremony represented not just an agreement between humanity and the Council, but a new model for how galactic civilizations might relate to each other. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the observation gallery watching the ceremony and feeling a sense of cautious optimism about the future. The agreement was just words on documents, but it represented a fundamental shift in attitudes and relationships. The Council had learned that respect could not be demanded or assumed, but had to be earned through fair treatment and genuine partnership. Humanity had learned that standing firm on principle sometimes required short-term sacrifice, but could lead to better outcomes in the long run. Within days of the treaty signing, human merchant vessels began returning to their previous routes throughout Council space. The response from traders and merchants of all species was immediate and enthusiastic because everyone had suffered from the disruption of the past 3 months. Human engineers returned to Krellian factories and began the process of restoring production capacity. Human patrol ships took up positions along key shipping lanes, and within weeks, the Marauder attacks began to decline as the raiders realized that the easy opportunities were disappearing on the Galactic Council station that had once seemed so empty. Without human presence, the 3 new human representatives took their seats for the first joint session under the new treaty. The other delegates watched with interest and some lingering resentment as the humans participated as full equals in the discussions. But even those who still harbored doubts about the new arrangement had to admit that the humans conducted themselves with professionalism and contributed valuable perspectives to the debate's. Ambassador Zexter approached Michelle Carter after the session ended and asked quietly if she believed they could truly build something better than what had existed before. Michelle considered the question carefully before responding that the potential was there, but success would depend on both sides honoring the spirit of the agreement and not just the letter. The humans had withdrawn not because they were weak, but because they refused to accept disrespect, and they had. Returned not because they needed the council, but because they believed in the value of cooperation among equals. Zexer extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, and Michelle grasped it firmly. The simple act represented more than just personal rapport between two diplomats because it symbolized a new relationship between humanity and the galactic community. The mistake had been recognized, and the lesson had been learned. And now the real work of building genuine partnership could begin with both sides. Understanding that respect was not something to be granted grudgingly, but something to be offered freely between civilizations that valued each other as true equals.